That night, I made a decision that would change everything. 6 months later, my son Michael was begging me to reconsider, but by then I'd already signed the papers giving my $3 million estate to the one person who'd never treated me like a burden. Now they're all scrambling to understand how the interfering old woman they dismissed became the architect of their financial future. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had family treat you like you were invisible just because of your age? Share your story below. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, and at 70 years old, I thought I'd earned the right to speak my mind at family gatherings. But apparently, in today's world, age and experience are liabilities rather than assets. Let me tell you how. I learned that lesson the hard way, and how it led to the most empowering decision of my entire life. My story begins 45 years ago, when I was a 25-year-old newlywed with dreams of a simple life as a wife and mother. I'd married Robert Whitmore, a good man who worked as a foreman at the Riverside manufacturing plant, and we'd settled into a modest 2-bedroom house in what was then the working-class neighborhood of Rosewood Hills. I'd planned to be a stay-at-home mother, maybe help with Robert's family's small bookkeeping business when the children were older. Life, as it often does, had different plans. When I was 35, Robert was killed in an industrial accident at the plant. A crane malfunction during a routine equipment move crushed him instantly, leaving me with 3 children, Michael, 12, Sarah, 9, and David, 6, and absolutely no idea how I was going to survive financially. The plant's insurance settlement was modest, enough to cover Robert's funeral and pay off our mortgage, but not nearly enough to support a family of 4 indefinitely. I had a high school diploma, some basic bookkeeping experience from helping Robert's father with his small appliance repair shop, and 3 grieving children who needed stability more than they needed anything else in the world. The widow's pension was barely enough to cover groceries, and I quickly realized that if we were going to make it, I'd need to figure out how to earn a real living. That's when I discovered I had a talent for numbers and an intuitive understanding of how money worked. I started by offering bookkeeping services to small businesses around Rosewood Hills, the corner grocery store, the local auto repair shop, a small restaurant that was struggling to track their expenses. I charged modest fees because I was learning as much as I was helping, but word spread quickly that Eleanor Whitmore could organize financial chaos and help small business owners understand where their money was actually going. Within 2 years, I had enough clients to support my family. Within 5 years, I'd earned my CPA certification through night school while the kids did homework at the kitchen table beside me. By the time Michael graduated high school, I'd established Whitmore and Associates as one of the most trusted accounting firms in our growing suburb. The business grew because I understood something that many accountants didn't. Small business. Owners and middle-class families needed more than just tax preparation and bookkeeping. They needed someone who could explain financial concepts in plain English, who could help them plan for their children's education and their own retirement, who could guide them through major financial decisions without making them feel ignorant or overwhelmed. I became known as the accountant who actually cared about her client's success rather than just collecting fees. When the Hendersons wanted to buy their first house, I spent hours helping them understand mortgage terms and create a realistic budget. When Maria Santos needed to expand her catering business, I helped her develop a business plan and secure financing. When the Patels were planning for their daughter's medical school expenses, I created an investment strategy that made their dreams achievable. My client list grew to include not just individuals and small businesses, but affluent families who needed comprehensive financial planning and portfolio management. I learned about stocks, bonds, real estate investment, tax strategies, and wealth preservation techniques. I studied market trends, analyzed investment opportunities, and developed expertise that allowed me to help my clients build and protect substantial assets. More importantly, I practiced what I preached. Every dollar I earned was carefully managed, invested, and allocated according to the same principles I taught my clients. I bought rental properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, diversified my investment portfolio, and built multiple income streams that provided security for my family and growing wealth for our future. The small house in Rosewood Hills where Robert and I had started our marriage became the foundation of a real estate portfolio. As the neighborhood gentrified and property values increased, I purchased additional rental properties, renovated them carefully, and attracted quality tenants who provided steady monthly income. I bought stocks in companies I understood, bonds that provided steady returns, and mutual funds that offered growth potential with managed risk. By the time I turned 50, Whitmore and Associates was managing portfolios for dozens of wealthy families, and my personal net worth had reached the seven-figure range. By 60, I owned my home outright, had significant holdings in rental real estate, and maintained investment accounts that generated more annual income than most people earned from full-time employment. When I finally retired at 65, my estate was valued at just over $3 million. The beautiful colonial in Rosewood Hills, now an upscale neighborhood, was worth $800,000. My rental properties generated $15,000 monthly in passive income. My investment portfolio was worth $1.8 million. I had $400,000 in cash savings and precious metals as insurance against economic uncertainty. I'd built this wealth not through inheritance or luck, but through 40 years of careful planning, intelligent decision-making, and the kind of financial discipline that comes from knowing what it's like to wonder how you'll feed your children. Every investment decision had been researched, every major purchase carefully considered, every financial strategy tested against my personal experience and professional expertise. This wasn't money I'd stumbled into or married into. This was wealth I'd created through knowledge, hard work, and strategic thinking. And I'd done it all while raising 3 children as a single mother, attending their school events, helping with homework, and making sure they had every opportunity I could provide. Michael, Sarah, and David had grown up watching me build this success. They'd seen me studying for my CPA exam at the kitchen table after working all day. They'd helped me prepare client tax returns during busy seasons. They'd celebrated with me when I bought each new rental property, when major clients signed long-term contracts, when investment returns exceeded expectations. More importantly, they'd benefited from my financial expertise throughout their lives. When Michael wanted to buy his first car, I helped him understand loan terms and negotiate a fair deal. When Sarah chose her college, I guided her through financial aid applications and scholarship opportunities. When David started his own family, I helped him and Lisa understand mortgage options and create a budget that allowed Lisa to stay home with their children. I'd paid for their college educations without them accumulating debt. I'd provided down payment assistance when they bought their first homes. I'd been the reliable financial safety net that allowed them to take career risks, pursue their goals, and build their own versions of success without the constant worries that had defined my early motherhood. But somewhere along the way, my children had stopped seeing my financial advice as valuable guidance from someone who'd overcome significant challenges to build substantial wealth. Instead, they'd begun viewing my input as interference from an old woman who didn't understand how things work nowadays. Michael, now 45, had settled into a comfortable but unremarkable career as a middle manager at a tech company. His salary was decent, around $85,000 annually, but not spectacular. He'd bought a house in a good suburban neighborhood, drove reliable cars, and maintained the kind of lifestyle that looked successful from the outside, but left little room for significant savings or financial security. His wife Jennifer had started as a real estate agent with big dreams and expensive tastes. She sold maybe 6 houses a year, earning commission income that varied wildly and averaged around $35,000 annually. But Jennifer lived as if she earned 6 figures, constantly upgrading their home decor, planning elaborate vacations they couldn't really afford, and pressuring Michael to invest in their lifestyle in ways that made my accountant's heart cringe. Their children Ashley and Brandon were typical teenagers from affluent suburbs. Expensive clothes, latest technology, assumption that college and cars and spring break trips were guaranteed rights rather than earned privileges. They were good kids fundamentally, but they'd grown up with a sense of entitlement that worried me, and financial expectations that their parents' actual income couldn't sustainably support. Sarah had moved to Portland for her career in environmental consulting and was doing well financially, but she'd also absorbed some ideas about work-life balance and authentic living that sometimes translated into judgment about my generation's focus on financial security and wealth building. She was single, owned a condo, had reasonable savings, and generally made sound financial decisions, but she'd also developed a tendency to view discussions about money as somehow materialistic or unseemly. David had made the most traditional choices, married his college girlfriend Lisa, worked steadily as an engineer, bought a house in a family-friendly neighborhood, and focused on providing for his two young children, Emma, 4, and Jacob, 2. Financially, David and Lisa were the most stable of my children, but they also lived paycheck to paycheck despite decent dual incomes because they prioritized current comfort over long-term wealth building. What frustrated me wasn't their life choices. I was proud of all 3 of my children and the adults they'd become. What frustrated me was their increasing dismissiveness of the financial wisdom I'd gained through decades of helping families build and preserve wealth. When I suggested strategies that could help them achieve their goals more effectively, I was being controlling. When I offered to share knowledge that could save them money or increase their security, I was interfering in their business. The irony was painful. They were happy to accept my financial help when they needed it, but they resented my financial advice when it might actually prevent them from needing help in the first place. When Michael's transmission failed, he'd called me for the $3,500 repair bill without hesitation. When Jennifer wanted granite countertops, she'd hinted about the cost until I offered to contribute to their kitchen renovation. When Ashley needed a laptop for school, Grandma Eleanor's credit card was suddenly very important, but suggest that maybe they should establish an emergency fund before planning their next vacation? Mom, we don't need lectures about money management. Mention that Jennifer's spending habits might be creating financial stress? Eleanor, every generation has different values about work and lifestyle. Offer to help them understand investment, options that could secure their children's college funds. We've got this handled, and we don't need input from someone who doesn't understand modern financial planning. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I was simultaneously the generous mother whose financial help they appreciated and the outdated nuisance whose financial expertise they dismissed. I was old-fashioned when I suggested budgeting strategies, but very useful when they needed money for unexpected expenses. My business success was admirable in the abstract, but my specific knowledge about wealth building was somehow irrelevant to their modern lives. This dynamic had been building for years, but it came to a head 6 months ago at what should have been a joyful celebration of my 70th birthday. I'd planned a dinner at Chez Laurent, one of the finest restaurants in our area, because I wanted to mark this milestone with the people I loved most. At 70, I felt grateful for my health, proud of what I'd accomplished, and excited about the legacy I'd built for my family's future. I'd invited all 3 of my children and their families. Sarah had flown in from Portland, which meant a lot to me since cross-country travel wasn't easy for her budget. David and Lisa were driving up with little Emma and Jacob, despite the challenge of managing toddlers in a fancy restaurant. Michael's family lived locally, so I'd assumed they'd be the easiest to coordinate with. The evening started with small disappointments that should have warned me about bigger problems ahead. Michael and Jennifer arrived 25 minutes late without calling to explain the delay. When they finally appeared, Jennifer immediately complained that the restaurant was too formal and wondered why we couldn't have just had a casual family dinner at home. Ashley and Brandon had brought their phones despite my explicit request for a device-free family celebration. And they spent the first 30 minutes texting and checking social media instead of participating in conversation. I tried to keep things light and pleasant, asking about work and school and family activities. Sarah shared stories about her latest environmental consulting project. David talked about Emma's progress in preschool and Jacob's latest toddler adventures. I thought we were having the kind of multi-generational conversation that makes family gatherings special. That's when Ashley mentioned that she'd been accepted to 3 different colleges but was having trouble deciding which one to attend. Northwestern, UC Berkeley, and Georgetown had all offered her admission, and she was weighing the pros and cons of each option. As her grandmother, who'd spent 4 decades helping families navigate major financial decisions, I was naturally interested in her thought process. "That's wonderful, Ashley," I said with genuine enthusiasm. "All 3 are excellent schools. Have you and your parents had a chance to compare the financial aid packages and understand what the total costs would be for each option?" I thought this was a perfectly reasonable question. College expenses were often a family's largest financial commitment after housing, and the debt burden could affect a young person's career choices for decades. As someone who'd helped dozens of families plan for education expenses, I knew that understanding the complete financial picture was crucial for making an informed decision. But Ashley just shrugged and said, "I guess my parents are handling all that stuff. I'm more focused on the academic programs and campus culture." Michael's face immediately darkened, and Jennifer shot him a look that clearly communicated her irritation. I recognized the expression. It was the same look she got whenever I said anything that could be interpreted as questioning their parenting or financial management. "Mom," Michael said in the carefully controlled tone he used when he was trying not to argue in public, "we've got Ashley's college situation completely handled. The financial details are between us and her, and we don't need input from anyone else about how to manage our family's education planning." I was taken aback by the defensive response to what I'd intended as a supportive question. "I wasn't trying to interfere, Michael. I was just asking because I remember how overwhelming all the financial aid paperwork can be. If you'd like any help understanding the different offers or planning for the costs, I'm happy to share what I've learned from helping other families go through this process." "That's exactly what we're talking about," Jennifer interrupted, her voice carrying the sharp edge it always had when she was building up to say something hurtful. "You automatically assume that we need your help, that we can't handle our own family's decisions without guidance from someone who doesn't understand how college admissions work in 2024. The implications stung. As if my decades of experience helping families with financial planning was irrelevant because I was old. As if the fact that I'd successfully navigated college planning for 3 children and dozens of clients somehow didn't apply to current situations. As if being 70 meant I couldn't possibly understand modern financial concepts, despite the fact that I'd been adapting to economic changes for my entire career. "I'm not assuming you need help," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "I'm offering to share knowledge if it would be useful. College costs have increased dramatically since you were students, and the financial aid system has become much more complex. I've helped several families recently who were surprised by hidden costs and debt implications they hadn't fully understood. See, that's the problem right there," Michael said, his voice getting louder despite the upscale restaurant setting. "You think that because you ran an accounting business in the 1980s and 1990s, you're automatically qualified to give advice about everything. College planning is more sophisticated now than when you were dealing with these issues. An accounting business in the 1980s and 1990s. As if Whitmore and Associates had been some small-town bookkeeping service instead of a respected CPA firm that had managed complex portfolios for wealthy families. As if I'd stopped learning and adapting when I turned 60. As if my professional expertise had an expiration date that coincided with my retirement. Michael, I've been a licensed CPA for over 30 years, and I managed investment portfolios until I retired 5 years ago," I said, my voice still calm but with an edge of irritation creeping in. "I'm not talking about college admission strategies. I'm talking about financial planning. which is my area of professional expertise. But if you prefer to handle everything independently, that's certainly your choice. That's when Michael said the words that changed everything between us forever. Mom, you need to understand something. You're 70 years old. You're from a completely different generation, and you don't understand how things work in the modern world. We appreciate everything you've done for our family over the years, but you need to accept that we're adults who can make our own decisions about our own lives. You're old. You need to stay out of our lives and let us handle our own affairs without constant interference from someone who doesn't understand current realities. The restaurant seemed to go completely silent around our table, though I'm sure the other diners continued their conversations. Sarah looked absolutely shocked and opened her mouth to argue, but Michael held up his hand to stop her before she could speak. I'm not trying to be cruel, he continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone adults use with difficult children. I'm being honest about a problem that's been building for years. Mom has always had control issues, and it's gotten worse as she's gotten older. She can't accept that we're capable adults who don't need her input on every decision we make. We can't live our lives constantly accommodating her need to be involved in matters that don't concern her. Jennifer nodded approvingly, clearly pleased that Michael was finally standing up to his controlling mother. It's hard to have these conversations, but Michael's absolutely right. Eleanor, you raised your children and lived your life. You made your choices and built your success. Now it's our turn to raise our children and live our lives. We need to do that without constant input and judgment from someone who doesn't understand how families operate in 2024. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, the people I'd sacrificed for, worried about, and loved unconditionally for decades. Sarah was furious and clearly wanted to defend me, but she was outnumbered and visiting from 3,000 miles away. David looked deeply uncomfortable, but wasn't going to challenge his older brother in public, especially with his small children present. Ashley and Brandon were still staring at their phones, probably embarrassed by the adult conflict, but not invested enough to engage with it. Lisa, David's wife, was focused on keeping Emma and Jacob quiet and entertained, clearly wanting to stay out of family drama that didn't directly involve her. The little ones were the only people at the table who seemed genuinely happy to be there, completely oblivious to the tension surrounding them. But it was the expression on Michael's face that broke my heart completely. Not anger or frustration, which I could have understood and argued with. Instead, I saw cold, calculated dismissal. He'd made a conscious decision that his mother's opinions, experience, and feelings were inconvenient obstacles to his preferred way of living. I wasn't a person deserving of respect or consideration. I was a problem to be managed and contained. The woman who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his college education was now too old to understand modern financial planning. The mother who'd built a successful business from nothing was somehow unqualified to offer guidance about wealth building. The grandmother who'd provided financial safety nets for his entire adult life was being told that her knowledge and experience were unwanted burdens. You know what, Michael? I said quietly, my voice steady despite the crushing pain in my chest. You're absolutely right. You are adults, and you can certainly handle your own affairs without any input from me. I apologize for offering unwanted advice and for assuming that my experience might be valuable to people I care about. I placed my napkin carefully on the table, stood up slowly, and looked at each of them one final time. Thank you all for coming to my birthday dinner. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope everything works out exactly as you've planned. Then I walked out of Chez Laurent with as much dignity as I could manage, got into my car, and drove home to my empty house in Rosewood Hills. I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd studied for my CPA exam while my children did homework, where I'd planned investment strategies that built our family's wealth, where I'd celebrated every milestone and worried through every challenge of their growing up years. And for the first time since Robert's death 45 years earlier, I felt completely alone. But I wasn't alone, I realized. There was someone who'd never made me feel like a burden, never dismissed my opinions as irrelevant, never treated my age as a disqualification for having valuable thoughts and feelings. Someone who'd been trying to tell me for months that I deserved better treatment than I was accepting from people who took my love for granted. I walked to my address book and found the phone number I'd been meaning to call for weeks. Catherine Rodriguez, my nurse, had become much more than a healthcare provider over the past 2 years. She'd become the daughter I'd always wanted, attentive, respectful, genuinely interested in my stories and advice, consistently kind in ways that reminded me what it felt like to be valued rather than tolerated. Catherine had been encouraging me to reconsider my relationship with my family for months, gently pointing out that people who truly loved me wouldn't consistently dismiss my feelings and expertise. She'd been urging me to think about what I really wanted my legacy to be, and whether leaving my wealth to people who didn't respect my wisdom was the best way to honor the work I'd done to build that wealth. That night, I called Catherine and asked if she'd like to have coffee the following morning. I told her I had some important decisions to make about my future, and I wanted to discuss them with someone who actually valued my judgment and cared about my well-being. Michael thought he was establishing boundaries and asserting his independence. Instead, he'd shown me exactly where my own boundaries needed to be drawn. He'd made it clear that my love and support were welcome, but my opinions and experience were not. He'd demonstrated that he saw me as a convenient resource rather than a respected family member, and he'd given me the clarity I needed to make the most important financial decision of my life. Because if my own son could dismiss me as too old to understand modern realities, maybe it was time for him to learn some very old-fashioned lessons about consequences, respect, and the difference between entitled expectations and earned inheritance. The next morning, I woke up in my empty house with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The pain from Michael's words was still there, sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death 45 years ago. The absolute certainty that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd raised 3 children, managed a business, and built a fortune, and I called Catherine Rodriguez at exactly 8 a.m. Catherine had been my nurse for 2 years, but calling her my nurse barely captured the relationship we'd developed. She was so much more than a healthcare provider. She'd become my confidant, my advisor, and the closest thing to a daughter I'd ever had. "Mrs. Whitmore," Catherine answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the warmth that had drawn me to her from our very first meeting. "How was your birthday dinner last night? I've been thinking about you." The fact that she remembered and cared enough to ask brought tears to my eyes immediately. When had anyone in my family last asked how I was feeling about something that mattered to me? When had Michael or Jennifer ever shown genuine interest in my emotional well-being rather than just my financial utility? "Catherine, could you come over for coffee this morning?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to talk to someone I trust about some important decisions, and you're the only person I know who actually listens to what I have to say." "Of course," she said immediately. "I'll be there in an hour. Are you all right? You sound different." "I'm more all right than I've been in years," I said, surprising myself with the truth of that statement. "I'll explain everything when you get here." While I waited for Catherine, I sat in my living room looking at the family photos that covered every surface. Graduations, weddings, holidays, birthdays spanning decades. Michael's high school graduation, where I'd cried with pride as he walked across the stage as valedictorian. Sarah's wedding in Portland, where I'd flown out to help with planning despite the expense. David's children taking their first steps, learning to ride bikes, celebrating Christmas mornings with the grandmother who spoiled them with thoughtful gifts and unlimited attention. In every photo, I was smiling, engaged, present for every milestone that mattered to them. But looking at those images now, I realized that none of them captured moments where my children were focused on my happiness, my achievements, my milestones. The photos told the story of a woman whose entire identity had been built around supporting other people's dreams, while her own worth was measured by her usefulness to their lives. When Catherine arrived, she took one look at my face and immediately pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than any embrace I'd received from my own children in years. Catherine was 45 years old, a registered nurse with 20 years of experience in geriatric care. But more importantly, she was someone who understood that elderly patients were still complete human beings with complex emotions, valuable insights, and dignity that deserved protection. "Tell me what happened," she said, as we sat at my kitchen table with coffee and the homemade churros she'd brought, because she knew they were my favorite. I told her everything. Michael's dismissive words, Jennifer's nodding approval, the silence from the rest of my family, the crushing realization that the people I'd devoted my life to saw me as nothing more than an aging inconvenience whose opinions had expired along with my usefulness as an active parent and provider. Catherine listened without interrupting, her dark eyes growing angrier with each detail I shared. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said finally, using the formal address that somehow conveyed more respect than my own children's casual, "Mom, I have to tell you something I've been wanting to say for months. The way your family treats you is not normal, and it's not acceptable." She leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades observing family dynamics in healthcare settings. "I work with elderly clients every day, and I see the full spectrum of how adult children relate to their aging parents. Some families are genuinely loving and respectful. Some are neglectful or absent. But your situation is different, and it's been bothering me for a long time." Catherine paused to sip her coffee, organizing her thoughts in the careful way that made her such an effective healthcare professional. "Your son doesn't treat you like someone who's old and needs accommodation. He treats you like someone whose opinions and feelings don't matter because you're old. There's a huge difference. A loving adult child might worry about their parents' physical limitations or cognitive changes, but they don't dismiss their parents' lifetime of knowledge and experience as irrelevant. They don't make their parent feel like a burden for having thoughts and feelings about family decisions." The validation of what I'd been sensing but couldn't quite articulate hit me like a physical relief. I've been wondering if I really was being too controlling, if maybe I didn't understand how much things had changed. "No," Catherine said firmly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've watched you make decisions about your health care, your finances, your daily life for 2 years. You're sharp as a tack. You're well-informed about current events. You understand modern technology better than most people your age. Your mind is absolutely fine, and your experience is valuable. The problem isn't that you're out of touch. The problem is that your family has decided your age disqualifies you from having opinions they need to consider." She stood up and began pacing around my kitchen, her professional composure giving way to personal indignation on my behalf. "Do you know what I see when I look at your relationship with your children? I see a successful, intelligent woman who built a business, raised 3 kids alone, accumulated significant wealth through smart planning, and continues to offer valuable guidance based on decades of real-world experience. And I see adult children who've decided that accepting your financial help doesn't obligate them to show you basic respect or consideration." Catherine turned to face me directly. "They want your money, but they don't want your wisdom. They want your support, but they don't want your input. They want the benefits of having a wealthy, generous mother, but they don't want to treat you like a person whose thoughts and feelings matter." The accuracy of her assessment was both painful and liberating. "So what do I do? They're my children. I love them even after last night." "Loving someone doesn't mean accepting disrespectful treatment from them," Catherine said, sitting back down and taking my hands in hers. "And it doesn't mean you have to continue relationships on terms that diminish your worth as a human being." Was quiet for a moment, then looked at me with an intensity I'd never seen from her before. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I tell you something personal?" Something I've never shared with a client before? I nodded, curious about this shift in our conversation. My mother died 3 years ago. She was 78, and she spent the last 10 years of her life apologizing for existing. My siblings treated her like a burden, complained about having to help. With her care, made her feel guilty for needing assistance with things that became difficult as she aged. She had money, not as much as you, but enough to be comfortable, and they spent her final years making her feel like every dollar she spent on herself was money she was stealing from their inheritance. Catherine's voice grew thick with emotion. She died believing she was a problem that her children were stuck dealing with. She never got to enjoy the wealth she'd worked her whole life to accumulate, because she felt guilty about spending money her kids thought belonged to them. She never got to speak her mind about family decisions because they'd trained her to believe her opinions were unwelcome burdens. Tears were running down Catherine's face now, and I found myself crying as well. For her mother, for myself, for all the elderly women who'd been taught that aging meant accepting diminishment. I became a geriatric nurse because of her, Catherine continued, because I wanted to help other older women maintain their dignity and autonomy in ways my mother never could. And Mrs. Whitmore, watching your family treat you the way they do, it breaks my heart because you're everything my mother could have been if she'd had the strength to demand better treatment. What are you saying I should do? I asked, though I was beginning to understand where this conversation was leading. Catherine took a deep breath and looked me directly in the eyes. I'm saying you have power you're not using. You have options you're not considering. And you have the right to make decisions about your life and your legacy based on who actually values and respects you, not just who happens to share your DNA. She stood up again and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the gardens I'd maintained for 30 years. You know what I've learned in 20 years of healthcare? The people who age with dignity and happiness are the ones who refuse to accept disrespectful treatment just because it comes from family members. They're the ones who build relationships with people who see their value, who appreciate their wisdom, who treat them like complete human beings instead of aging inconveniences. Catherine turned back to me with a slight smile that I'd never seen before, not her professional, caring nurse smile, but something more personal and strategic. Mrs. Whitmore, you told me once that you have no debt, significant liquid assets, and an estate worth over $3 million. Is that correct? Yes, I said, wondering where she was going with this. And this estate is currently set to be inherited by your 3 children? That's right. Equal thirds, with additional provisions for the grandchildren's education. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. And Michael made it very clear last night that he doesn't want your input or guidance about his family's decisions. He wants you to stay out of their lives and let them handle their affairs independently. He did. Then maybe it's time to take him at his word, Catherine said quietly. Maybe it's time to let him handle his affairs completely independently, including the financial consequences of his choices. The implication hit me like lightning. Catherine, are you suggesting... I'm suggesting that you have the right to leave your estate to people who actually value you, she said calmly. People who treat you with respect and kindness. People who appreciate your wisdom instead of dismissing it. People who see you as a complete human being instead of an aging ATM they're obligated to tolerate. She sat back down and took my hands again. Mrs. Whitmore, you worked for 40 years to build wealth that will outlive you. Why should that wealth go to people who've made it clear they don't respect the woman who created it? Why should Michael benefit financially from dismissing you as too old to understand modern realities? Why should Jennifer profit from treating you like an interfering burden? The questions were ones I'd never allowed myself to consider, but they felt revolutionary in their simplicity. But they're my children. And you'll always love them, Catherine said gently. But love doesn't require financial reward for disrespectful behavior. Love doesn't mean you have to ignore how they actually treat you. Love doesn't obligate you to pretend that hurtful actions don't have consequences. Catherine paused, then continued with the kind of careful professionalism that told me she'd thought about this conversation many times before having it. Mrs. Whitmore, what if I told you there was another option? What if instead of leaving your estate to people who dismiss your value, you could leave it to someone who genuinely appreciates everything you've accomplished? Someone who listens to your stories, values your advice, and treats you with the respect you've earned? What are you saying? I'm saying that over the past 2 years, you've become more than a client to me. You've become the mother figure I lost 3 years ago. You've given me guidance about my own financial planning, encouraged me to pursue additional certifications in my field, supported me through a difficult breakup, and treated me with more consistent kindness than I've received from anyone else in my adult life. Catherine's voice grew stronger and more confident. You've told me repeatedly that I'm like the daughter you never had. Well, Mrs. Whitmore, you're like the mother I wish I'd been able to protect and honor while she was alive. The mother I should have encouraged to value herself as much as she valued everyone else. I stared at her, beginning to understand the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Are you proposing that I change my will? I'm proposing that you consider all your options, Catherine said carefully, including the option of leaving your estate to someone who has consistently demonstrated love, respect, and appreciation for who you are as a person. Someone who would honor your legacy by using your wealth in ways that reflect your values and your wisdom. The idea was so radical, so completely outside anything I'd ever considered, that I couldn't process it immediately. Leave my $3 million estate to Catherine instead of my children? Disinherit Michael, Sarah, and David because of one terrible conversation? But it wasn't one conversation, I realized. It was years of dismissive treatment, years of being valued for my financial contributions while my opinions and feelings were systematically devalued. It was a pattern of behavior that had culminated in Michael's cruel words, but hadn't started there. Catherine, I said slowly, if I were to consider something like this, what would that mean for you? It would mean I could do things your children will never think to do, she said without hesitation. It would mean I could establish a scholarship, fund in your name for single mothers pursuing business degrees. It would mean I could donate to organizations that support elderly women's dignity and autonomy. It would mean I could invest your wealth in ways that create positive change in the world, the way you did when you were actively managing your business. Catherine's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm as she continued. Mrs. Whitmore, imagine if your legacy wasn't just money passed down to people who took your generosity for granted. Imagine if your legacy was a foundation that helped other women achieve the kind of success you built, or programs that ensured elderly people were treated with respect instead of being dismissed as burdens. The vision she was painting was compelling, in ways I hadn't anticipated. My wealth could become a force for positive change instead of just an inheritance that would allow my children to live more comfortably, while continuing to dismiss the woman who'd made their comfort possible. But what about Michael and Sarah and David? I asked. What about the grandchildren? What about them? Catherine asked gently. Michael made it very clear that he doesn't want your involvement in his life. He's 45 years old with a decent job and no debt because you paid for his education. Sarah is successful in her career and financially stable. David is doing well and has never depended on your money for his daily expenses. None of them are struggling or in need of financial rescue. She was right. My children were all functional, adults who'd benefited enormously from my support throughout their lives but weren't dependent on inheritance for their survival or success. As for the grandchildren, Catherine continued, Ashley is intelligent and capable. She'll succeed in college and career based on her own efforts, not because she inherited money she didn't earn. Brandon will learn the value of work and achievement, instead of expecting financial rewards simply for existing. Emma and Jacob will grow up understanding that love and money are separate things, and that respect must be earned rather than assumed. The more Catherine talked, the more sense her perspective made. You're saying that leaving them money might actually be harmful? I'm saying that giving people money they haven't earned for accomplishments they haven't achieved can rob them of the motivation to develop their own strength and character, Catherine said. Your children have become comfortable dismissing you, partly because they know your love comes with financial benefits, regardless of how they treat you. Removing those benefits might teach them to value relationships for intrinsic rather than financial reasons. We talked for 3 more hours, exploring every aspect of what such a dramatic change would mean. Catherine shared stories from her healthcare experience about families that had been destroyed by inheritance conflicts, and families that had been strengthened by elderly relatives who'd made unconventional but wise decisions about their legacies. She told me about clients who'd left their estates to charities, caregivers, or friends who'd shown genuine love and respect during their final years. She described the peace these clients had felt, knowing their wealth would be used by people who shared their values, rather than people who felt entitled to financial rewards simply because of genetic relationships. Mrs. Whitmore, Catherine said, as our conversation began to wind down, you don't have to make any decisions today, but I want you to consider one question. If you could design your legacy to reflect the values and principles that guided your life, what would that look like? The question stayed with me after Catherine left. I spent the rest of the day walking through my house, looking at the material evidence of 40 years of careful planning and wise decision-making. The house itself, elegant and comfortable, but not ostentatious. The artwork I'd collected from local artists whose careers I'd wanted to support. The library filled with books about business, investing, and personal development that had guided my professional growth. Everything in my home reflected thoughtful choices made by someone who understood the difference between wealth and materialism, someone who valued substance over status, someone who'd used money as a tool for creating security and opportunity rather than simply accumulating possessions. Did I want that wealth to go to people who'd never shared those values? People who saw money as something to spend rather than something to invest? People who valued lifestyle and appearances over financial security and long-term planning? That evening, I called my attorney, James Harrison, who'd been handling my legal affairs for 15 years. James was in his early 60s, a respected estate planning lawyer who'd helped me structure my investments and update my will multiple times as my circumstances changed. "Eleanor," James said when his secretary put me through. "How nice to hear from you. How was your birthday celebration?" "Educational," I said dryly. "James, I need to schedule an appointment to discuss some significant changes to my estate planning. Can you see me this week?" "Of course. Is everything all right? Has your health situation changed?" "My health is fine," I said. "But my perspective on how I want my legacy structured has evolved considerably. I need to explore some options I've never considered before." "I see," James said, his tone becoming more formal and professional. "This sounds like something we should discuss in detail. Can you come in Thursday morning at 10? "Perfect. And James? I'll be bringing someone with me, Catherine Rodriguez, my nurse. She's become family to me in ways that my actual family apparently isn't interested in being." There was a pause on James's end, the kind of silence that suggested he was beginning to understand the nature of my call. Estate planning attorneys had seen every variety of family drama, and they knew the signs when clients were reconsidering fundamental assumptions about inheritance. "I'll look forward to meeting Ms. Rodriguez," James said carefully. "And Eleanor? Whatever you're considering, we'll make sure it's structured properly and that all your options are fully explored before you make any final decisions." "Thank you. James, I have a feeling this is going to be a very interesting conversation." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen one more time, looking at the phone where I'd received so many calls from my children over the years. Calls asking for financial help, calls requesting my presence at family events, calls updating me on grandchildren's activities and achievements. But when had any of them last called simply to ask how I was doing, or to share something they thought I'd find interesting, or to seek my advice about something important? The answer was painful in its clarity. Never. My children called me when they needed something from me, but they never called simply because they valued my companionship or perspective. Catherine, on the other hand, called me regularly just to chat. She asked about my garden, my reading, my thoughts on current events. She sought my advice about her career decisions, her relationship choices, her financial planning. She treated me like someone whose opinions mattered and whose wisdom had value. Michael had told me I was too old to understand modern realities. Maybe it was time to show him that this old woman understood the most important reality of all. Respect is not a given. Love is not unconditional. And inheritance is not a right. Maybe it was time to teach my family that actions have consequences, even when those actions are words spoken in anger and dismissed as unimportant. Maybe it was time to ensure that my legacy reflected my values rather than just my DNA. Thursday morning couldn't come soon enough. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. I dressed carefully for my appointment with James Harrison, a navy blue suit that conveyed the seriousness of a woman making important decisions about millions of dollars, paired with the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. I wanted to look like someone whose judgment should be respected, not someone whose age made her vulnerable to poor decision-making. Catherine arrived at my house at 9:30, looking equally professional in a charcoal gray dress and blazer that emphasized her role as a healthcare professional rather than just a companion. She carried a leather portfolio that, I would soon learn, contained documentation that would prove crucial to our conversation with James. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine asked as we drove toward downtown Millbrook, where James Harrison's law firm occupied the top 2 floors of the historic Merchants Building. "I'm ready to explore options," I said carefully. "I'm ready to understand what's possible and what the consequences would be. Whether I'm ready to actually implement dramatic changes, we'll see what James has to say." Harrison, Blackwood, and Associates had been handling my legal affairs since I'd first needed sophisticated estate planning 15 years earlier. James Harrison was a partner in his early 60s who specialized in complex estate planning for high net worth individuals. He'd seen every variety of family drama, inheritance dispute, and unconventional bequest decision that wealthy families could produce. The law firm's offices reflected the kind of understated elegance that successful attorneys cultivated. Mahogany paneling, Persian rugs, law books that were actually read rather than just displayed for effect. James's personal office overlooked the town square where I'd first opened Whitmore and Associates 40 years earlier, a coincidence that felt symbolically appropriate for the conversation we were about to have. "Eleanor," James said as his secretary showed us into his office, "it's wonderful to see you again. And you must be Catherine Rodriguez. Eleanor mentioned that you've become an important part of her life." Catherine shook James's hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to professional interactions. "Thank you for including me in this meeting, Mr. Harrison. Mrs. Whitmore has become very important to me as well, and I want to make sure her interests are fully protected in whatever decisions she makes." James gestured for us to sit in the comfortable chairs arranged around a small conference table near his office windows. He'd already pulled my file, and I could see the current version of my will, a 23-page document that reflected years of careful planning and multiple revisions as my estate had grown and my family's circumstances had changed. "Eleanor, before we begin, I want to make sure I understand the nature of this appointment," James said, settling into his chair with the careful attention of someone preparing for a complex legal discussion. "You mentioned wanting to explore significant changes to your estate planning. Can you help me understand what's prompted this reconsideration?" I took a deep breath and told James everything: the pattern of dismissive treatment from my children, the escalating conflicts over my attempts to offer financial guidance, the devastating conversation at my birthday dinner when Michael had explicitly told me I was too old to have opinions worth considering about family decisions. James listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, his expression growing, more serious as I described the dynamics that had led me to question whether my current estate plan reflected my actual values and relationships. "I see," James said when I finished. "And Catherine, what's your perspective on this situation?" Catherine opened her portfolio and removed several documents. "Mr. Harrison, I've been working in geriatric healthcare for 20 years, and I've seen how family dynamics around aging parents can become toxic when adult children begin viewing their parents primarily as sources of inheritance rather than human beings deserving of respect." She handed James a letter printed on official letterhead from Riverside Medical Group, where she'd worked for the past 8 years. "This is a character reference from my supervisor, Dr. Margaret Chen, attesting to my professional reputation and ethical standards. I want you to understand that my relationship with Mrs. Whitmore isn't some scheme to manipulate a vulnerable elderly client. It's a genuine friendship that's developed because we share similar values and perspectives." James read the letter carefully, his eyebrows rising slightly, as he absorbed Dr. Chen's glowing assessment of Catherine's professional competence and personal integrity. "Dr. Chen speaks very highly of your clinical skills and your advocacy for elderly patients' rights and dignity. Mrs. Whitmore isn't just a client to me," Catherine continued. "She's become a mentor and friend who's helped me understand financial planning, encouraged my professional development, and treated me with more consistent respect and kindness than I've received from my own extended family since my mother died." Catherine handed James another document. "This is a financial statement showing my current assets and debts. I want you to understand that I'm not someone in financial distress who might be trying to take advantage of a wealthy elderly woman. I own my own home, have substantial savings, and earn a good living from my nursing practice." James studied Catherine's financial statement, and I could see him processing the information. Catherine owned a modest but well-maintained house worth about $180,000, had $85,000 in savings and retirement accounts, and carried no debt except her mortgage. She was clearly someone who managed money responsibly and lived within her means. Exactly the kind of person who could be trusted with significant financial responsibility. "Catherine, these documents suggest that you're financially stable and professionally respected," James said. "But I need to ask directly, are you encouraging Mrs. Whitmore to change her will in ways that would benefit you financially?" "Yes," Catherine said without hesitation, "but not for the reasons you might assume." The directness of her answer surprised both James and me. I'd expected her to be more diplomatic in addressing the obvious question about her motivations. "Let me explain," Catherine continued. "Mrs. Whitmore's current will leaves her estate to 3 adult children who have made it clear that they don't respect her wisdom, don't value her opinions, and see her primarily as a source of financial support rather than a person whose thoughts and feelings matter. They want her money, but they don't want her guidance. They accept her generosity, but they dismiss her expertise." Catherine leaned forward, her voice carrying the passion of someone speaking about a cause she truly believed in. "I'm encouraging Mrs. Whitmore to consider leaving her estate to someone who actually values her as a complete human being. Someone who listens to her advice, respects her experience, and treats her with the dignity she's earned through 40 years of building wealth and raising children and contributing to her community." James nodded slowly. "And you believe you're that person?" "I know I am," Catherine said with quiet confidence. "Over the past 2 years, Mrs. Whitmore has become the mother figure I lost when my own mother died. She's given me guidance about financial planning, encouraged me to pursue additional certifications in my field, supported me through personal challenges, and consistently treated me with kindness and respect." Catherine pulled out another document, a detailed plan she'd apparently been working on for some time. "If Mrs. Whitmore chooses to leave her estate to me, I wouldn't simply inherit the money and live comfortably. I would use her wealth to create a lasting legacy that reflects her values and honors the work she did to build that wealth." She handed the plan to James, who began reading with obvious interest. I propose establishing the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for women's financial empowerment, which would provide scholarships for single mothers pursuing business degrees, fund financial literacy programs for elderly women, and support organizations that advocate for seniors' rights and dignity. The detail and thoughtfulness of Catherine's plan took my breath away. She'd obviously been thinking about this possibility for weeks or months, developing a vision for how my wealth could create positive change in the world rather than simply making my already comfortable children more comfortable. Additionally, Catherine continued, I would maintain the family's rental properties as income-generating assets, but I would use the proceeds to fund ongoing charitable work rather than personal lifestyle enhancement. Mrs. Whitmore built her wealth through careful investment and community contribution. I would honor that legacy by ensuring her money continues to serve those same principles. James was quiet for several minutes, reading through Catherine's detailed proposal. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from professional caution to genuine interest. Catherine, this is quite impressive, he said. You've clearly put considerable thought into how you would handle the responsibilities that would come with inheriting a substantial estate. But Eleanor, I need to make sure you understand the implications of what you're considering. James turned to face me directly. If you change your will to leave your estate to Catherine instead of your children, there will be consequences beyond just the financial redistribution. Your children will likely be shocked, hurt, and angry. They may challenge the will in court, claiming you were manipulated or that you lacked the mental capacity to make such a decision. Could they succeed in overturning my will? I asked. Unlikely, given your obvious mental competence and the detailed documentation we would create about your decision-making process, James said. But they could create expensive legal battles. That would consume time, money, and emotional energy. They could also cut off contact with you entirely, meaning you might not see your grandchildren again. The possibility of losing access to Ashley, Brandon, Emma, and Jacob was painful to consider. Despite my conflicts with their parents, I loved my grandchildren and had hoped to remain part of their lives as they grew up. On the other hand, James continued, you have the absolute legal right to leave your estate to anyone you choose, for any reasons you consider valid. If you believe your children don't appreciate your generosity and don't treat you with appropriate respect, those are legitimate grounds for reconsidering how you want your wealth distributed after your death. James leaned back in his chair, assuming the thoughtful posture of someone preparing to offer comprehensive legal advice. Let me outline your options as I see them. He pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a basic diagram. Option 1. You leave your current will unchanged. Your children inherit equal shares of your estate. They use the money as they see fit, and you hope that receiving substantial inheritances somehow teaches them to value the woman who made those inheritances. Possible. What do you think the likelihood of that outcome would be? I asked. James's expression suggested he'd seen this scenario play out many times before. In my experience, people who take someone's generosity for granted while that person is alive tend to take inherited wealth for granted as well. Inheritance rarely changes fundamental character traits or relationship dynamics. He made another note on his pad. Option 2. You modify your current will to include conditions that require your children to demonstrate specific behaviors or meet certain criteria before receiving their inheritances. For example, you could require them to complete financial literacy courses, volunteer with organizations that serve elderly populations, or write detailed letters explaining what they learned from your example and how they plan to honor your legacy. The idea of conditional inheritance was intriguing. Could that actually work? It's legally possible, James said, but enforcement can be complicated, and it often creates resentment rather than genuine appreciation. People who comply with inheritance conditions to receive money rarely develop authentic gratitude or understanding through that process. James made a third note. Option 3. You restructure your estate to leave modest amounts to your children, enough to show that you still care about them, but not enough to make them wealthy. and you leave the majority of your estate to Catherine and the foundation she's proposed. What would constitute modest amounts? I asked. That's entirely up to you, James said. Some clients in similar situations leave children amounts equal to what they've already provided over the years. So if you've given Michael $50,000 in financial help throughout his adult life, you might leave him $50,000 in your will as well. Others leave token amounts like $5,000 or $10,000 with letters explaining that the children have already benefited substantially from their parents' wealth during the parents' lifetime. Catherine had been listening to this legal discussion without comment, but now she spoke up. Mrs. Whitmore, there's another consideration that Mr. Harrison hasn't mentioned yet. How do you want to handle this decision in terms of timing? Do you want to keep your estate plan changes secret until after your death? Or do you want your family to know about the changes while you're still alive? James nodded approvingly. That's an excellent question, Catherine. Eleanor, some clients prefer to keep will changes confidential so they can observe their family's natural behavior without the influence of changed inheritance expectations. Others prefer to inform their children about the changes, so the children have an opportunity to modify their behavior and potentially earn their way back into a more substantial inheritance. The strategic implications of timing were complex. If I told Michael about the will changes, he might suddenly become more respectful and attentive. But would that represent genuine character growth or just manipulative behavior motivated by financial self-interest? If I kept the changes secret, I'd know that any improved treatment was authentic, but I'd also miss the opportunity to see whether my children were capable of learning and growth when faced with real consequences for their actions. What do you recommend? I asked James. Based on what you've told me about your family dynamics, I'd suggest a hybrid approach, James said. We create the new will immediately, with the bulk of your estate going to Catherine and the foundation, and modest amounts going to your children. We document your decision-making process thoroughly to prevent successful legal challenges. Then, we give your family a limited opportunity to demonstrate changed behavior. James began sketching out a timeline on his legal pad. You could inform them about the will changes in 3 months, giving them notice that their inheritances have been dramatically reduced because of their treatment of you, but offering them the possibility of earning restoration to your original will if they demonstrate sustained, genuine respect and appreciation over a significant period, say, 2 years. The idea of giving my children a chance to earn their inheritances through improved behavior appealed to me. It would test whether they were capable of treating me better when they understood that their financial future depended on it, and it would give me the satisfaction of seeing them work to rebuild relationships they'd damaged through neglect and dismissiveness. What would happen if I died during that 2-year testing period? I asked. We would structure the will so that your estate disposition would depend on their behavior up to the point of your death, James explained. If they'd demonstrated sustained improvement, they could inherit according to your original intentions. If they continued treating you poorly, Catherine would inherit as planned. It gives them motivation to change while protecting your right to reward or withhold inheritances based on how they actually treat you. Catherine was taking notes on everything, James said, but she looked up with a slight smile. I like this approach because it puts the power back in Mrs. Whitmore's hands. Instead of her having to accept poor treatment because family is family, her children would have to earn their inheritances by demonstrating that they actually value her as a person. James spent the next hour walking us through the specific legal mechanisms that would be required to implement this strategy. We discussed trust structures, foundation establishment, documentation requirements, and challenge prevention measures. The legal complexity was substantial, but James assured us that everything we were considering was well within normal estate planning parameters. Eleanor, I want to emphasize one important point, James said as our meeting began to wind down. What you're considering isn't unusual or inappropriate. I've helped many clients restructure their estates when family relationships deteriorated, or when they decided their values weren't reflected in their original inheritance plans. The law explicitly recognizes your right to distribute your wealth according to your own judgment about who deserves to benefit from what you've worked to create. He pulled out a thick folder and handed it to me. These are examples of similar estate restructurings I've handled over the years, obviously with identifying information removed to protect client confidentiality. I want you to see that you're not the first person to face these issues, and you won't be the last. As I flipped through the folder, I saw will modifications, trust structures, and foundation establishments that reflected a wide range of family conflicts and value-based decisions. Wealthy parents who disinherited children for drug addiction, gambling problems, or abusive behavior. Successful business owners who'd left their companies to employees rather than family members who'd shown no interest in the work. Elderly. Clients who'd chosen to benefit caregivers, friends, or charitable organizations, rather than relatives who'd provided financial expectations, but not emotional support. The common thread in all these cases, James explained, is that the clients reached a point where they decided their legacy should reflect their values and relationships, rather than just their biological connections. They wanted their wealth to go to people who would honor what that wealth represented, and who had demonstrated genuine care for the person who created it. As we prepared to leave James's office, he handed us both detailed packets of information about next steps. If you decide to proceed with this estate restructuring, we'll need about 6 weeks to complete all the documentation. The foundation establishment will require additional paperwork with the state, and will want to create very detailed records of your decision-making process to prevent any successful challenges. James walked us to the elevator, his manner more personal than it had been at the beginning of our meeting. Eleanor, I've been practicing estate law for 30 years, and I've seen the full spectrum of family dynamics around inheritance. What you're considering takes courage, but it also takes wisdom. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for adult children is refuse to enable their bad behavior by rewarding it financially. As Catherine and I drove back to my house, we were both quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what we'd just discussed. The legal framework for completely restructuring my estate and my family's financial future was not only possible, but relatively straightforward. The emotional and relational implications were far more complex. Mrs. Whitmore, Catherine said finally, how are you feeling about everything we learned today? Empowered, I said, surprising myself with the immediate certainty of that response. For the first time in years, I feel like I have real options instead of just accepting whatever treatment my family decides to give me. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. The legal framework gives you leverage you've never had before. Instead of hoping your children will choose to treat you better, you can create incentives that make better treatment worth their while. Are you comfortable with the idea that you might not inherit anything if my children manage to improve their behavior over the next 2 years? I asked. Catherine's answer came without hesitation. Mrs. Whitmore, what I want most is for you to be treated with the respect and love you deserve. If your children figure out how to provide that because they're motivated by inheritance concerns, I'll consider that a victory. The money would be nice, but what really matters to me is seeing you valued appropriately by the people who should love you most. Her response reinforced my growing conviction that Catherine genuinely cared about my well-being rather than just my wealth. Someone focused primarily on financial gain would have been less enthusiastic about giving my children opportunities to earn their inheritances back. That evening, I sat in my study with James's information packets spread across the desk where I'd made countless financial decisions over the past 30 years. The parallels between this choice and the investment decisions that had built my wealth were striking. In both cases, I was evaluating potential returns based on demonstrated performance, allocating resources to maximize positive outcomes, and refusing to let emotions override strategic judgment. When I'd invested in real estate, I'd chosen properties in neighborhoods where I could see evidence of growth potential and responsible development. When I'd selected stocks, I'd researched Companies with strong management, ethical practices, and sustainable business models. When I'd chosen clients for my accounting firm, I'd worked with people who valued expertise, paid their bills promptly, and treated my staff with respect. My estate planning should follow the same principles. Instead of leaving money to people, based solely on genetic relationships, I should consider who had demonstrated the values, character, and appreciation that would make them good stewards of what I'd worked to create. Michael had made it clear that he didn't value my judgment, or want my input about important decisions. Jennifer had dismissed my professional expertise as outdated and irrelevant. Ashley and Brandon had been raised to see me as a source of gifts and financial support, rather than wisdom and guidance. Catherine, on the other hand, sought my advice about major decisions, respected my experience, appreciated my knowledge, and treated me with consistent kindness and consideration. She'd developed a thoughtful plan for using my wealth to create positive change in the world, and she'd demonstrated the financial responsibility and ethical standards that suggested she could be trusted with significant resources. The choice, when viewed through the lens of strategic investment rather than family obligation, was remarkably clear. I called James Harrison's office and left a message asking him to begin drafting the new estate plan we'd discussed. Then I called Catherine and asked if she'd like to have dinner the following evening to discuss the foundation planning in more detail. For the first time since my birthday dinner disaster, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just enduring whatever treatment my family decided to provide. I felt like the successful businesswoman who'd built a fortune through smart choices and strategic thinking, rather than the dismissed grandmother who was expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention her children threw her way. Michael had told me I was too old to understand modern realities. Maybe it was time to show him that this old woman understood the most important reality of all. Respect is something that must be earned, and inheritance is something that should be deserved. The transformation was beginning, and there would be no going back. 6 months after my disastrous birthday dinner, I stood in my living room holding 2 documents that would change my family's life forever. The first was my new will, signed just that morning in James Harrison's office, legally transferring my $3 million estate to Catherine Rodriguez and the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Women's Financial Empowerment. The second was a letter I'd spent 3 weeks writing and rewriting, explaining to my children exactly why their mother had chosen to disinherit them. Today was the day I would reveal what their dismissive words had cost them. The past 6 months had been the most peaceful and fulfilling period I'd experienced in years. Without the constant stress of trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't value me, I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under decades of attempting to be the perfect mother, grandmother, and family financial safety. Catherine and I had spent countless hours planning the foundation that would bear my name. We'd researched organizations that supported elderly women's rights, identified scholarship opportunities for single mothers pursuing business degrees, and developed partnerships with financial literacy programs that helped women build wealth and independence. My money would create lasting change in the lives of women who faced the same challenges I'd overcome 40 years earlier. More importantly, I'd learned what it felt like to have my opinions valued and my expertise respected. Catherine consulted me on every major decision in her life: career moves, financial planning, even dating choices. She introduced me to her friends as someone whose advice had been instrumental in her professional development. She treated me like a mentor and mother figure whose wisdom had genuine value. The contrast with my biological family had become even more stark during these months of minimal contact. Michael had called exactly 3 times, once to ask if I could help with Ashley's college application fees, once to mention that their furnace needed replacement and hint about the cost, and once to invite me to Brandon's high school graduation with less than a week's notice. Each interaction had followed the same pattern. Michael would be minimally polite while extracting whatever he needed from me, then end the conversation as quickly as possible. No questions about my health, my activities, or my emotional well-being. No genuine interest in my thoughts or feelings about anything that didn't directly benefit his family. Sarah had called more frequently, but with the same underlying dynamic. She'd update me on her work and social life, accept my financial contribution to her vacation fund, then change the subject whenever I tried to offer perspective on her career decisions or relationship choices. I was expected to be interested in her life, while my own thoughts and experiences were treated as irrelevant background noise. David had been the most disappointing because he'd always been the most sensitive of my children. He called regularly and included me in family activities with Emma and Jacob, but he'd also made it clear that he wouldn't challenge Michael's position that I needed to stay in my lane regarding family decisions. David wanted my presence and financial support, but not my opinions or guidance. None of them had apologized for Michael's cruel words at my birthday dinner. None of them had acknowledged that telling a 70-year-old woman she was too old to have valuable opinions might have been hurtful or disrespectful. They'd all simply accepted Michael's framing that I was an interfering old woman who needed to learn appropriate boundaries. Well, today they would learn about boundaries. My boundaries. I'd arranged for all 3 of my children and their families to come for Sunday dinner, the first time I'd hosted the entire family since my birthday disaster. I'd told them I had important news to share about my future plans, and they'd all agreed to attend, probably assuming I was going to announce some kind of assisted living arrangement or healthcare decision that would affect their inheritance. Timeline. They had no idea that their inheritance had already been decided. Catherine arrived at noon to help with final preparations. She'd offered to be present when I revealed the news, both for emotional support and to answer any questions about the foundation we'd established. She looked elegant and professional in a navy blue dress that conveyed the seriousness of someone who'd just become a millionaire, though she didn't know that the final paperwork had been completed that morning. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine asked as we arranged the formal dining room for what would likely be the last family meal I'd ever host. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I said, and I meant it. The clarity I'd gained over the past 6 months had crystallized into absolute certainty that this was the right decision. These people have spent years treating me like a convenient resource rather than a human being deserving of respect. Today, they'll learn what that choice has cost them. We prepared a meal that reflected 40 years of family traditions. Pot roast with vegetables, homemade rolls, the green bean casserole that had been requested at every holiday gathering, apple pie made from fruit I'd grown in my own garden. It was comfort food designed to remind everyone of the decades of love and care I'd provided, making the contrast with their treatment of me even more pointed. David's family arrived first, with little Emma and Jacob rushing to hug their grandmother, while David and Lisa offered the kind of polite affection that characterized most of our recent interactions. Emma, now 5, immediately began telling me about her kindergarten activities with the enthusiasm of a child who still saw her grandmother as someone interesting and important. Jacob, 3, climbed into my lap with the unconscious trust of someone who'd never been treated as anything other than precious and valuable. The irony wasn't lost on me that the youngest family members were the only ones who still treated me with genuine affection and interest. Sarah arrived alone, having flown in from Portland specifically for this dinner. She seemed more subdued than usual, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. Over the past months, I'd noticed that Sarah had begun to question the family dynamic more than her brothers, occasionally making comments about Michael's dismissive attitude or wondering aloud whether I was being treated fairly. Michael's family arrived last, 20 minutes late as usual, with Ashley complaining about having to miss some social activity for another family dinner, and Brandon clearly annoyed at being separated from his video games. Jennifer made her standard complaints about my house being too formal and wondered why we couldn't have just ordered pizza. Michael himself seemed distracted and slightly impatient, checking his phone repeatedly in the way that suggested he had somewhere else he'd rather be. The contrast between their arrival and David's family's warm greeting was stark. Emma and Jacob had rushed to me with joy and excitement. Ashley and Brandon barely acknowledged my presence, and neither Michael nor Jennifer showed any genuine pleasure at seeing me. We made small talk during dinner: Ashley's college plans, Brandon's summer, job prospects, Emma's swimming lessons, Jacob's latest vocabulary developments. I asked questions and showed interest in their activities, while noting that none of them reciprocated by asking about my life, my health, or my activities during the month since we'd last gathered. When I mentioned that Catherine and I had been spending a lot of time together, working on some exciting projects, Michael's response was telling. "That's nice, Mom. It's good that you have someone to keep you busy." Someone to keep me busy. As if my life were empty space that needed to be filled, rather than a collection of meaningful activities and relationships that I'd chosen because they brought me joy and fulfillment. After we'd finished dinner and cleared the table, I asked everyone to join me in the living room for the important announcement I'd promised to share. Catherine excused herself to the kitchen, giving me privacy for the initial revelation while remaining close enough to join the conversation when I needed her support. "Before I begin," I said, standing in front of the fireplace where family photos chronicled decades of holidays, graduations, and celebrations, "I want all of you to know that what I'm about to tell you isn't a decision I've made lightly or quickly. It's the result of months of careful consideration about what kind of legacy I want to leave and who has demonstrated the values and character that deserve to benefit from the wealth I've spent 40 years building." The seriousness of my tone got everyone's attention. Even Ashley and Brandon looked up from their phones, sensing that something important was happening. 6 months ago, at my 70th birthday dinner, Michael told me that I was too old to have valuable opinions about modern life. He told me I needed to stay out of your lives and stop offering guidance based on my decades of experience building a business, raising children, and managing money. Several of you agreed with him, and none of you defended me. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably realizing that his birthday dinner comments were about to have consequences he hadn't anticipated. That conversation made me realize that while you're all happy to accept my financial help when you need it, you don't actually respect me as a person whose thoughts and feelings matter. You want my money, but you don't want my wisdom. You want my support, but you don't want my input. You want the benefits of having a wealthy mother, but you don't want to treat me with the courtesy and consideration that wealth represents. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand to stop her. "I'm not finished." I walked to the side table where I'd placed my new will and Catherine's foundation documents. "I've spent the past 6 months working with my attorney and with Catherine to restructure my estate in ways that reflect my actual values and relationships, rather than just my biological connections." The room went very quiet. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was happening. As of this morning, my will has been changed to leave the bulk of my estate, approximately $2.8 million, to Catherine Rodriguez and the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Women's Financial Empowerment. The silence that followed was profound. Michael's face went white, then red, as he processed what I'd just said. Jennifer's mouth fell open in shock. David looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Sarah stared at me with an expression of disbelief and growing understanding. "Each of you will inherit exactly $15,000, I continued calmly. "Enough to show that you're still my children and that I still care about you, but not. Enough to make you wealthy based on money you've done nothing to earn and wisdom you've chosen not to value." Michael found his voice first, though it came out as more of a strangled shout than normal speech. "Mom, you can't be serious. You can't. Leave everything to some nurse you've known for 2 years instead of your own children." "I can, and I have," I said firmly. "Catherine has spent 2 years treating me with respect, valuing my advice, and demonstrating the character and values that deserve to be rewarded. You've spent the same 2 years treating me like an inconvenient obligation whose opinions don't matter because I'm old." Jennifer was sputtering with indignation. "This is insane. Eleanor, you're clearly not thinking rationally. No one gives away $3 million to someone who isn't even family. Someone who isn't even family, I repeated slowly. Catherine has been more family to me in 2 years than any of you have been in the past 5. She calls to check on me when she's not being paid to do it. She asks my advice about important decisions because she values my experience. She treats me like a human being whose thoughts and feelings matter. David finally found his voice, though it was shaky with emotion. Mom, I don't understand. We love you. We've always loved you. Love isn't just a feeling, David, I said gently. Love is how you treat people. Love is whether you show respect for their dignity and value their contributions to your life. Love is whether you defend them when they're being attacked or dismissed. I looked around the room at their shocked faces. When Michael told me I was too old to have valuable opinions, where was your love then, David? When Jennifer dismissed my professional expertise as outdated, where was your love, Sarah? When your children were taught to see me as a source of gifts rather than wisdom, where was your love, Michael? Ashley, who had been listening to this entire exchange with growing awareness, suddenly spoke up. Grandma, are you saying we don't get any inheritance because of what Dad said at your birthday dinner? I'm saying you don't get any inheritance because of how I've been treated consistently for years, I replied. Your father's words at my birthday dinner were just the final confirmation of attitudes that had been building for a long time. Brandon, finally understanding that his video game money was disappearing, joined the conversation. But Grandma, that's not fair. We didn't do anything wrong. You didn't do anything right either, I said sadly. When was the last time either of you asked me about my life, my interests, my thoughts about anything? When was the last time you treated me like a person you were genuinely interested in, rather than just an old lady you had to tolerate at family gatherings? The truth of that observation hung in the air. Neither Ashley nor Brandon could answer, because they'd never treated me as anything other than a source of birthday money and Christmas gifts. Michael was recovering from his initial shock and moving into anger. Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't punish your entire family because you didn't like one conversation. We'll contest this, Will. We'll prove you were manipulated by this nurse who's obviously taking advantage of you. Catherine, I called toward the kitchen. Would you please join us? Catherine entered the living room with the composed confidence of someone who'd anticipated this moment and prepared for it thoroughly. She carried a folder containing documentation that would address every challenge my family might attempt to raise. Michael, Jennifer, this is Catherine Rodriguez, I said formally. Catherine, these are my son Michael and his wife Jennifer, the people who've decided I'm too old to understand modern realities. Catherine extended her hand to Michael, who ignored it completely. Jennifer crossed her arms and glared as if Catherine were some kind of con artist who'd hypnotized me into giving away their inheritance. Before you accuse Catherine of manipulating me, I continued, you should know that she's a licensed registered nurse with 20 years of experience, owns her own home, has substantial savings, and earns a good living. She didn't need my money. She earned my respect and gratitude by treating me like a human being whose wisdom and experience have value. Catherine opened her folder and removed several documents. I also want you to know that your mother's decision was made with full legal consultation. James Harrison, her estate attorney, has documented her mental competence and decision-making capacity extensively. Any legal challenge you attempt will fail, and it will cost you far more in attorney fees than the $15,000 you're actually inheriting. Sarah, who had been quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Mom, I need to ask you something directly. Do you really believe we don't love you? Do you really think we only see you as a source of money? The pain in Sarah's voice was genuine, and I felt a moment of regret for the daughter who'd always been the most emotionally aware of my children. Sarah, I believe you love the idea of me, I said gently. You love having a mother who's successful and generous and available when you need support. But do you love the actual person I am? Do you value my thoughts and opinions and experience? Or do you just tolerate those aspects of me because they come with financial benefits? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing, not just my question but her own behavior over the past few years. I think, she said slowly, I've taken you for granted in ways I didn't realize. I think we all have. Taking someone for granted isn't the same as dismissing them as too old to have valuable opinions, I said. But you're right that you've all taken me for granted. You've assumed my love and support would always be available regardless of how you treated me. Michael was pacing now, his anger building as he processed the magnitude of what he'd lost. This is unbelievable. Mom, we're talking about $3 million. You can't give away our inheritance to some stranger because your feelings were hurt. Your inheritance? I repeated. Michael, you didn't earn this money. You didn't make the investments, build the business, or create the wealth. This is my money, earned through my work and my decisions. You have no more right to inherit it than any other stranger on the street. But we're your children, Jennifer shouted. Family doesn't abandon family over hurt feelings. You're absolutely right, I said calmly. Family doesn't abandon family, but you abandoned me emotionally years ago. You turned me into nothing more than a convenient bank account with opinions you were obligated to tolerate. You stopped seeing me as a complete human being deserving of respect and consideration. Catherine had been listening to this exchange, without comment, but now she spoke directly to my family. I want all of you to understand something. Your mother didn't make this decision out of spite or hurt feelings. She made it because I've demonstrated the values and character that deserve to benefit from what she's worked to create. Catherine pulled out the foundation documents. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation will provide scholarships for single mothers pursuing business degrees, fund financial literacy programs for elderly women, and support organizations that advocate for seniors' rights and dignity. Your mother's wealth will create lasting change in the lives of women who face the same challenges she overcame. Instead of going to people who took her generosity for granted, Catherine continued, her money will help women who understand the value of hard work, education, and financial independence. Instead of rewarding people who dismissed her wisdom, her legacy will honor the principles that guided her success. Michael turned on Catherine with pure fury. You manipulative bitch! You've brainwashed my mother into giving you our family's money. Michael, I snapped, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult people and situations. Do not speak to Catherine that way in my house. She has shown me more respect and kindness in 2 years than you've shown me in the past 5. Catherine remained calm despite Michael's verbal attack. Michael, I understand you're upset about losing money you expected to inherit, but maybe this is an opportunity to ask yourself why your mother felt more valued by a nurse she hired than by the children she raised. The room fell silent again as the truth of Catherine's statement sank in. Why had I felt more appreciated? By someone I paid to provide health care than by the children I'd loved unconditionally for decades? David, who had been struggling with obvious emotional conflict throughout this conversation, finally found his voice. Mom, is there anything we can do? Any way to fix this? The vulnerability in David's question touched my heart. Of all, my children. He seemed the most genuinely distressed by what he was learning about our family dynamics rather than just angry about the money. David, the fact that you're asking that question gives me hope, I said softly. But the time for fixing this was 6 months ago, when Michael told me I was too old to have valuable opinions, and you all either agreed with him or stayed silent. I looked around the room at all of them. The time for fixing this was over the past 5 years, when you could have chosen to treat me with respect instead of taking my love and support for granted. The time for fixing this was every phone call when you could have asked about my well-being instead of just updating me on your needs. But what if we change? Ashley asked, speaking with more maturity than she'd shown all evening. What if we start treating you better? Can you change the will back? The The question showed that Ashley was beginning to understand the connection between actions and consequences, which gave me some hope for her future character development. Ashley, that's a very thoughtful question, I said. But here's what you need to understand. If you start treating me better because you want to inherit my money, that's not really better treatment. That's manipulation. Real respect and love aren't conditional on financial rewards. Catherine added gently, Your grandmother deserves to be treated well because she's a person worthy of respect, not because she has money you want to inherit. The conversation continued for another hour, with various family members cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and eventually, something approaching acceptance. Sarah was the first to acknowledge that the family's treatment of me had been problematic, followed eventually by David's admission that he should have defended me more actively over the years. Michael and Jennifer never moved beyond anger and accusations, but that didn't surprise me. They'd been the most egregious in their dismissive treatment, and they had the most to lose financially from my decision. As the evening wound down and my family prepared to leave, the dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the accommodating mother who accepted whatever treatment her children chose to provide. I was a woman who demonstrated that disrespect had consequences and that my love and support were gifts to be earned rather than entitlements to be assumed. Before you all go, I said as they gathered their things, I want you to understand one final thing. This decision isn't about punishing you. It's about honoring the person I've worked my entire life to become. I built this wealth through principles of hard work, respect for others, and using money as a tool for positive change. I want my legacy to reflect those same principles. Catherine stood beside me as my family filed out of my house, most of them still too shocked to process fully what had happened. Emma and Jacob, too young to understand the adult conflict, hugged me goodbye with their usual enthusiasm. Ashley and Brandon were subdued but managed polite farewells. David hugged me longer than usual, whispering that he loved me and wanted to find a way to rebuild our relationship on better terms. Michael and Jennifer left without saying goodbye. After everyone had gone, Catherine and I sat in my living room, both emotionally exhausted from the confrontation, but also feeling a sense of completion and closure. How do you feel? Catherine asked. Free, I said immediately. For the first time in years, I feel completely free to be myself, without worrying about whether my thoughts and opinions will be acceptable to people who should have valued them unconditionally. Catherine smiled. And now what happens? Now, we build something beautiful with the foundation, I said. We help women who face the same challenges I overcame 40 years ago. We create opportunities for people who understand the value of hard work and education. We make sure my money continues to make a positive difference in the world. I looked around my living room, seeing it now as the home of a woman who'd taken control of her own destiny rather than accepting whatever treatment others chose to provide. And Catherine, thank you for helping me remember that respect isn't optional, that dignity isn't negotiable, and that love without consideration isn't really love at all. 6 months later, Michael called me for the first time since that Sunday dinner. He'd heard through Sarah that I'd been hospitalized briefly for a minor procedure, and he wanted to check on my recovery. His tone was different, more respectful, more genuinely concerned about my well-being than my usefulness to his family. Mom, he said near the end of our conversation, I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night, about how we treated you, about what real love and respect look like. I think you were right about some things. What things? I asked, curious about his perspective. I think we took you for granted, he said quietly. I think we got so comfortable with your love and support that we forgot you were a person who deserved our consideration and respect in return. The admission was more than I'd expected from Michael, and it gave me hope that he might be capable of genuine growth. Michael, I appreciate you saying that, I said. It means a lot to know that you've been reflecting on our family dynamics. Mom, is there any chance I mean, would you consider... He trailed off, unable to finish the question about inheritance restoration. Michael, if you want to rebuild our relationship, I'm open to that, I said gently. But it has to be because you value having me in your life, not because you want access to my money. The will isn't changing, but our relationship could improve if you're genuinely committed to treating me with respect. He was quiet for a moment. I think I'd like to try. Not for the money. I mean, obviously I wish that was different, but I think I'd like to try to be a better son. Then let's start with something simple, I said. Why don't you come over for dinner next Sunday? Just you. No agenda other than spending time together and talking about things that matter to both of us. I'd like that, Michael said. And for the first time in years, he sounded like the son I'd raised rather than the entitled adult who'd dismissed me as too old to matter. 3 years have passed since I restructured my estate and revealed that decision to my family. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation has provided scholarships to 47 single mothers pursuing business degrees, funded financial literacy programs in 12 communities, and supported advocacy organizations that have successfully lobbied for stronger protections for elderly people's rights and dignity. My relationships with my children have evolved in different directions. Sarah moved back to the East Coast and visits regularly, having genuinely committed to rebuilding our relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial expectation. David never wavered in his love, and our relationship has deepened as he's made conscious efforts to value my wisdom and experience. Michael's journey has been more complex, but he's made genuine progress in learning to see me as a complete person, deserving of consideration rather than just a resource for his family's benefit. Our relationship will never be what it might have been if he'd learned these lessons earlier, but it's become something authentic and meaningful. Catherine and I have become true family, not through genetics, but through choice, respect, and shared values. She manages the foundation with intelligence and integrity, ensuring that my wealth continues to create positive change long after I'm gone. More importantly, she's given me the experience of being genuinely valued and appreciated for who I am, rather than what I can provide. The most unexpected outcome has been my grandchildren's evolving understanding of what happened and why. Ashley, now in college on an academic scholarship she earned through her own merit, has thanked me for teaching her that respect must be earned and that money shouldn't be expected simply because of family relationships. Brandon has become more thoughtful about how he treats elderly people, having learned that dismissing someone because of their age can have serious consequences. Emma and Jacob, still young, simply love their grandmother unconditionally. But they're growing up in a family that's learned to value wisdom and experience rather than taking them for granted. Sometimes people ask me if I regret my decision to disinherit my children in favor of Catherine and the foundation. The answer is simple. I've never regretted any decision that resulted in my being treated with dignity and respect rather than being taken for granted. Michael told me I was too old to understand modern realities. He was wrong. The most important reality, in any era, is that every person deserves to be valued for their wisdom, respected for their experience, and treated with kindness regardless of their age. My son thought he was putting me in my place when he dismissed me as irrelevant. Instead, he helped me find my place, not as someone begging for scraps of attention from people who saw me as a burden, but as someone whose legacy would reflect her values and whose final years would be spent with people who genuinely appreciated her worth. If you're watching this video because someone in your life has made you feel invisible, irrelevant, or too old to matter, I want you to remember something. You have more power than you think. You have the right to decide who benefits from your love, your support, and your resources. You have the right to demand respect from people who want access to what you've worked to create. Family is important, but family isn't a free pass to treat people badly. Love is precious, but love without respect isn't really love at all. And Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is show people that their actions have consequences, even when those people share your DNA. You're never too old to change your life. You're never too old to demand better treatment, and you're never too old to show people that underestimating you was the biggest mistake they ever made. What's your story? Have you ever had family treat you like you didn't matter because of your age? Have you ever had to choose between accepting disrespect and protecting your dignity? Share your experiences in the comments below, and remember, you have more power than you think. Like and subscribe for more stories about turning life's worst moments into powerful transformations. Because sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us exactly how strong we really are. And remember, respect isn't optional, dignity isn't negotiable, and you're never too old to rewrite your story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.